Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth of our Friday night spooky sessions. Now, due to the results of a poll that we did recently, the second highest votes asked for stories about curses. So tonight, I'm going to start with a fact-based story about a curse, and then the follow-up story will be a fictional ghost story, just slightly shorter because the first story is a little bit longer this week. So I hope you enjoy both stories. I'd like you to sit back and relax while I tell you the story of the witch doctor's curse. In the 18th century, the English city of Liverpool became prosperous through the so-called ships of shame, which transported millions of black African slaves to America and the West Indies. The rapidly growing colonies of the New World were in need of a massive labour force, and the vile businessmen of England thought that the black men, women and children of Africa could fulfil the demand for workers. Around 10 million African slaves were shipped across the Atlantic in appalling conditions. Each slave was confined to a space in the ship's hold which had less room than a coffin. They were shackled to one another and therefore had to wallow in each other's dirt for months on end. Not surprisingly, fever, dysentery and a high mortality rate were the commonplace on the slave ships during the hazarded voyage from Africa to the western side of the Atlantic. Sick and dying slaves were regarded as a dead loss to the slave sellers, so many of the kidnapped Africans suspected of being ill were thrown overboard. In November 1781, a Captain Collingwood of the slave ship Zong ordered his men to take turns throwing 133 slaves into the ocean. Just a few of the poor souls jettisoned into the waters were ill, but Captain Collingwood thought the cruel measure would be an effective way to conserve the ship's fresh water supply. Well, against this evil backdrop of cruelty and disregard for human life, the following strange tale unfolded. It began in the year 1783, when a Liverpool slave ship called the Amelia took its captured human cargo from the port of Old Calabar in Nigeria. Among the men, women and children who had been abducted and taken by force from their country, there was a young boy of 13 named Abu and his uncle Oba, who was an elderly gentleman and was growing blind. Well, Oba knew a little English, and during the Amelia's voyage to the West Indies, the boy Abu suffered a fit, and his uncle Oba called out to the crew to give his nephew water. Well, the old man's frantic request fell on deaf ears, and so he and a number of other slaves down in the hold started to rattle their chains in protest. The master of the Amelia, Captain Mallard, was absolutely enraged, and he had the protesting slaves brought up on deck where they were subjected to being flogged. The 13-year-old boy Abu was also flogged, and he fainted. His uncle Oba threw himself over the boy and begged the captain to stop flogging him, and begged him to give him a drink of fresh water. He struggled to explain in his limited English that the boy was suffering from fits, and when he saw these fits, when he had these fits, he saw visions, and he had visions of prophecy. They were all of a prophetic nature. The child was the only son of his tribe's witch doctor. and that if he was not immediately taken back to Nigeria, a terrible curse would fall upon the captain of the Amelia. Well, when the captain heard this, he just grabbed the boy and lifted him up. The boy screamed, and the captain just threw the boy overboard into the sea. There was an uproar of protest from the slaves above and below deck. And when they saw the captain's cowardly and callous act, there was murmuring, which turned to sighing, which turned to crying, which became sobbing, and the slaves looked upon Captain Mallard with eyes filled with hatred. The old man Oba sobbed and was immediately taken down into the hold. And as he was taken down to be chained up again, he screamed at the captain and pointed at him. Rattling his chains at him, he screamed, "Curse you, curse the captain and his family." 10 months later, all the slaves in the Amelia had been sold, all except Oba. Well, eventually a couple called George and Catherine Hughes bought Oba. They were very kind to him. Oba lived with them as their friend, not as their slave, for the next 10 years of his life, but he died of a fever. Not long after Captain Mallard's return to the port of Liverpool, bad luck and weird coincidences seemed to haunt him and his family. His eldest son, Matthew, who had a cottage overlooking the shore at Formby, which is a suburb of Liverpool, went insane after telling his wife that an enormous black dog with bright red eyes seemed to follow him everywhere, wherever he went. There was this huge black dog with these deep-set, bright red eyes just glaring at him. The dog would follow him on his walks among the sand dunes down at the beach, but there were never any dog paw prints to be found. But Matthew Mallard insisted that this dog was following him every step of his walk. His wife watched him turn into a shambling, nervous wreck. And then, after a few days, when he began ranting and screaming about this black dog, she ended up packing a bag and deserting him. Matthew Mallard was later committed to a lunatic asylum. Weeks after that, Captain Mallard was awakened in the middle of the night of his Duke Street home when he heard a strange drum beating in the distance. Even his neighbours heard the strange drum beat, but nobody could tell where the noise was coming from. 3 nights later, the infuriating rhythm of the drum ceased abruptly at 4:15 a.m, and Captain Mallard later learned that his elderly mother in nearby Frederick Street had died at that exact time after screaming out once in her sleep. A month later, the same eerie drumbeat disturbed the sleep of Captain Mallard once more. This time, he awoke in his 4-post bed to find his wife lying beside him in a pool of blood. She'd miscarried their baby in her sleep. Then something chilling took place one Sunday after Captain Mallard had been entertaining a Captain Slater at his Duke Street home. Mrs. Mallard found a strange object in the mantelpiece of the living room. She thought it was a doll's head, but when she picked it up and inspected it, she saw that it was far too lifelike, and it looked hideous. She screamed and threw it in the fire. Well, Captain Mallard retrieved it from the coals, and he saw to his horror that it was the shrivelled head of a human being. It was a shrunken head, and it was used by shaman and witch doctors as a black magic talisman. Mallard thought that Captain Slater had planted the head in his living room, but Slater swore that he'd never set eyes on the shrunken head before. Mrs. Vaughan, who was the maid of all work at the Mallard household, later reported hearing the sound of the drum again, and said that she'd been having vivid nightmares about a black man's face grinning at her, painted with white stripes. Captain Mallard decided to go back to sea in an attempt to get away from all the ghostly goings-on in his Duke Street home. Well, he captained a vessel called the Moonrise, which was bound for Lyttelton in New Zealand. He was to bring back a consignment of wool and frozen mutton, but his ship later vanished without a trace. 26 years later, a British ship called the Horizon caught sight of a large sailing vessel drifting off the coast of Chile in South America. Well, as the Horizon drew nearer, they noticed that the vessel was apparently unmanned. The masts and the ragged sails of the ship were covered in what looked like thick deposits of a green mould. And on the prow, faded with the weather and the passage of time, the crew of the Horizon could see the name of the ship. It was the Moonrise. Well, this chose a boarding party from the Horizon, and they went to investigate. And when one man jumped onto the deck, the timbers had decayed to such an extent that they just crumbled beneath him. The other men hauled their colleague out of the hole and walked very carefully around the deck. When they went into the captain's cabin, a skeleton in ragged clothes was found, and the atmosphere had a putrid, rotting smell. 13 more skeletons were found elsewhere on the Moonrise. Clothes were found, and the atmosphere was thick of people who had died of sickness a long time ago. The captain of the Horizon inspected the damp, mouldy pages of the ship's log, but it was just to find that the ink had become too blurred by moisture to be able to see what had been written there. Suddenly there was a loud groaning noise echoing down the length of the Moonrise, followed by a loud crack. The captain and his men hastened back to the deck of the Horizon, and they watched in horror as the main mast crushed into the waters. Well, in a state of panic, they started rowing their little boat as fast as they could to prevent themselves from being sucked under by the largest ship going beneath the waves. And as their boat moved away, the Moonrise and its skeleton crew started to break up. The remaining 2 masts toppled onto the Moonrise, and within seconds the rotting ship sank to the bottom of the ocean. The men of the Horizon rowed away just in time to avoid being sucked down with the rapidly sinking vessel. When news of the strange discovery of the long-lost ship reached the ears of Captain Mallard's wife, who was by this time now in her 60s, she took a turn and fainted. She told the doctor treating her that her husband had been cursed to death for killing a witch doctor's son. And after that she became coherent. She started foaming at the mouth, her eyes rolled back in her head, and at 3 a.m, she died. And according to local legend, the sound of a dog howling in the street was heard at the time of her death. This strange tale was reported in the local newspaper, the Liverpool Echo. And when Mr. and Mrs. Hughes, the couple who had looked after the old slave, Oba, read about the discovery of Captain Mallard's old ship and the ensuing death of his wife, they knew that the witch doctor's curse had done its work. And that, my friends, is the story of the witch doctor's curse. And I do apologise for mixing my words up. Excuse me, I must have a drink. This spooky storytelling is thirsty work. Now, my second tale for you tonight, as I say, it's shorter than normal, but I'm very, very conscious of our time together, so I want to stick within that time frame, and this will be the case until you tell me otherwise. We're going to try and stick to 30 minutes. This story is called The Demon in the Window. Before you read any further, I want you to know that I've not hyped up or altered any of what you're about to read to scare you. I'm not easily scared, and what happened to me frightened me more than I've been in a long time. That being said, you might feel the same way after you read this. The information, locations and dates haven't been changed in any way. It's important for you to know that I've been involved in ghost hunting for many years. I run tours at haunted locations for new ghost hunters and thrill seekers, and prior to the investigation, we always have a short question and answer session. Well, at these functions, it's almost a guarantee that someone will ask me if a ghost can follow them home. I used to say something along the lines of, well, I don't see why not. They can be bound to certain areas, but many spirits come and go as they please. But you probably shouldn't worry about it yourself. One night after an investigation of a Swansea, Massachusetts residence, well, that changed the way I felt about that answer. The investigation was conducted as normal, and after we were done, the equipment was broken down, packed into the van, and off home we went. And while driving back to Cranston, Rhode Island, to where our cars were parked, we discussed how we felt how the night went. Nobody had any eerie feelings. We all agreed that it felt quiet, and we could only base any further conclusions after what we could find in our evidence review. Well, it was shortly after 1 a.m. when I got to my house in Attleborough. As soon as I walked through the door, I put my equipment case at the base of the stairs to my room and I went upstairs. I was exhausted, I just wanted to climb into bed. I then proceeded to have the worst nightmare that I've ever had, and I'd like to share it with you. The dream happened like this. I was alone. It was a dark night with a clear sky. The moon and the stars were clearly visible. And although I had no light to use, I could still see what was ahead of me. I was in a labyrinth of some sort, walking deeper and deeper into the winding pathways. The labyrinth had tall, overbearing walls with small glass windows just big enough to see through. And every time I would look at the windows, a skeletal face would stare back at me from the other side. It was like the walls were hollow and something was following me inside of them. My heart would race, and if I looked at the window, so I kept my eyes forward and focused on the maze. I finally came to the centre of the labyrinth. There was an oval-shaped tomb-like building with a barred door on the front with 2 separate keyholes. Subconsciously, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a key. And as I looked at the key, a hissing whisper came about in the background of the dream saying, "This key has one purpose. This key can unlock this door." Well, I put the key in the first keyhole and unlocked the door. And as I opened the door, it was dark, but there was a faint glow of orange light that I could see from the top of a spiral stairway. As I began down the stairs, I encountered this cloaked, starved, skeletal monster. Its skin was stretched tightly across its face. It had very small patches of long, straggly hair, and as it held up a lamp close to its face, I could see it more clearly. Its eyes were fixed on me, and it smiled, revealing a few black teeth. At this point, I ran back to the door. I tried to lock it, but the key wouldn't work. I remembered it saying that the key could only unlock the door. I started to trace my way back through the maze. Its voice became louder in the background as I unleashed it from its tomb. I can't remember what was being said because I was running for my life. I finally came to the exit of the maze. There was a short road that I followed that came to the driveway of a large mansion. I thought I was safe for a second, and as I started towards the house, the figure appeared again at the front of the mansion gate. It held up its hand like a puppeteer, and it conjured two black, large dogs. The dogs chased me through the yard, and I climbed the fence to get away from them. Well, on the other side of the fence, I ended up in some neighbourhood that felt familiar, but there was still no one of anyone. There was nobody around me to talk to. There was no sign of life in any of the houses. I entered a coffee shop and sat down at a table, and all of a sudden there was a loud banging on the windows of the shop. The banging became increasingly louder until I just closed my eyes. I thought I was still dreaming. Unluckily, this was reality. All of the hinge windows in my room were suddenly open. It is impossible to open these windows from the outside. I have to tell you this, because there is a lock mechanism that goes through the top of the window and into the wall, which then has a sliding lock bolt which comes through the side of that mechanism to keep the window from moving completely. Still slightly shocked, I closed all of the windows. I then grabbed my digital voice recorder and hit record. I put the recorder on the edge of my bed. I went downstairs to see if any more windows were open. None of them were. Well, upon returning to my room, I listened back to the recorder. While I was upstairs, I captured something, or someone, banging on the window again. It couldn't get it open this time, and with a frustrated hissing whisper, it said, "Damn you. Damn you." This was the same voice from my dream. It was the voice of that monster in the tomb. Whatever was behind that door that I'd opened was in my room that night. It made its presence known. Since then, there's been no further sign of it here. I heard its voice. I've drawn its face. I will never forget what happened. You may choose to believe this or not. It's up to you. But I caution everyone from now on, if you dabble with spirits, you need strong willpower. They can come into your life, and when they do, it can be very, very frightening. Well, that my friends, is the conclusion of our 2 stories for this week. Now, I'd like to mention, with regard to the first story that I told you, I hope that didn't upset anyone or, cause anyone to have any upset. That wasn't my intention. All the basic cursed stories there are, stories about curses that there are, the real ones, mostly everybody's heard of them, and an awful lot of them are about Egyptian tombs and mummies' curses and things like that. And to be honest with you, I didn't want to bring you the story of Tutankhamun's tomb or Ramesses III or anybody like that, because let's face it, the world and his wife knows the story about Tutankhamun's tomb and what happened to, all the people, Howard Carter, Lord Carnarvon, any of the workers that were involved in that dig. And a lot of it is split. Is it real? Is it just conjecture? Is it coincidence? Or is there really such a thing as a paranormal curse? And I've got to apologise again for missing a lot of my words tonight. I am sorry about that. I actually believe in curses. I am very wary of them. I must admit, I was, and I know a lot of people will probably laugh at me for saying this, but when I was in my 20s, there was some local gypsies, and I mean proper gypsies, walking around the area, and they were selling bits of heather and offering palm readings at the front door. And it was one of those broke weeks. We've all had them, and we still get them, where you literally don't have a spare penny. And I remember saying to this girl at the door, I would love to help you, but I don't have anything. I remember offering her a bar of chocolate, actually. And she muttered something and spat at my feet. And somebody said to me, oh, she's cursed you. And I don't know whether it was psychosomatic or what, but the next month, if I could have said that I had bad luck, I had bad luck. I was forever falling over, hurting myself, doing things to myself. It was just stuff concerned with me, not really anybody else around me. It was just concerned with me. And I just remember thinking, well, if she was truly psychic, she would have known that I didn't have a penny in my purse. So, what can I say about that? But there are certain periods of history that I feel should never, ever be forgotten. Obviously, being Jewish, one of them is the Holocaust. And on par with that, and I put it on an exact equal level with that, are the horrors of slavery. I don't have the words to express how I feel about slavery. It is one of the most disgusting practices ever used by man upon his fellow human beings. And I know it's been practiced for millennia. I know it goes back practically almost to the dawn of time, but it still doesn't make it any less horrendous. And the way that people have been treated, even to this day, because of the colour of their skin, to me is evil. It's wrong. It's reprehensible. It's everything that I could possibly think of that's bad. That's how I feel about it. So again, I apologise if my first story has upset or hurt anyone. That wasn't my intention. It was to show, well, it was first off to read you the story and to show you what can happen with a curse and what happened in this particular story to that sea captain and his nearest and dearest. And if you mess with things beyond your ken, then beware of consequences. And I'm sure we can all agree on that. With regard to your second story, I have to apologise. I thought that was a work of fiction. Apparently it isn't. It was actually written by an actual tour guide for who does tour guides and works with haunted attractions. So all this happened on the 9th of March 2014. So it wasn't that long ago. So you got a story based on fact, but written up a little bit in urban legend for your first story. But the second one is based on fact. So I shall leave it up to you, my wonderful audience, to tell me what you think about it in the comments. Now we're just very slightly beyond our time, so I would like to thank you once again for coming to join me in another of our Friday night spooky sessions. I do hope that you enjoyed it, and I will see you again next week. And in the meantime, stay spooky.